Well, they did it again, guys. They went back in time. Why is it that whenever any of the head writers push the reset button, and this is a very loose term that I've conjured up, we seem to have this same formula for the first 3 episodes? Present, future, past. Present, future, past. Present, future, past. Present, future, past. Present, future, past! I'll add a little asterisk to Series 11 because the Ghost Monument isn't exactly set in the future per se, but it's certainly futuristic in content. You'll notice I missed out Series 8 as well, where almost the same order of stories occurred, with the exception of Deep Breath, which is set in the past. Let's be honest with ourselves though, that episode could have taken place in any time zone and it wouldn't have mattered one bit. My point is that with all the hype and excitement surrounding the first female Doctor, you'd have thought more drastic changes would have been made to the formulae of the episodes. Instead, it seems to me that we have just had another new face stuck onto a show whose producers are too afraid to change anything to its structure. So, without further ado, let's look into my critical report on this week's Doctor Who episode and see what juicy goodness can be found inside. The TARDIS lands our characters in 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Once again, they throw the Doctor can't control the TARDIS trope into the mix to explain why they're here in the first place, because let's be fair, it would make the Doctor look very bad if she took our group of multicultural companions there for a day out. Fortunately, the opening of the story reveals the showrunners haven't forgotten to put our characters in dangerous situations. This makes a nice change from the Doctor giving his companions the tourist's guide to the universe, which is almost parodied in this episode when Ryan receives a slap in the middle of the street. The fact this took place before the 5-minute mark also shows that we're going to be in for a rough ride. Not that I enjoy witnessing people being racist, but there's considerably more tension and danger in this week's episode than last week's. I was even more impressed by our characters becoming a little braver since their last adventure too, by rejecting the Doctor's urges for them to stay safe inside the TARDIS. I also really enjoyed witnessing our younger companions learning to appreciate the time zone that they came from, with phrases like, "It's not perfect, but it's better," coming from Ryan. There seemed to be a hopeful argument against racism that flowed throughout the story, that the least we can do is make sure that the law is fair towards everyone, and that we might have to put up with and arrest a few bad apples in the present, but at least it's not as bad as it once was. With a writer like Mallory Blackman behind the story of this episode, this certainly seems like a good decision, given that she has written about race in her fiction series Noughts and Crosses. Not once did I feel like the racism was over the top or exaggerated in this episode, with the only possible exception being when they're all hiding in the motel. It wasn't like we saw people tailing our protagonists at any point besides Krasko, or maybe they just did a bad job of climbing through a window. What I also thought was effective was that we got the sense of just how riddled into the society racism was at the time without them using the N-word once in the script. On the one hand, it makes all the white people who refrain from using the word look far too polite for the era, and I can imagine other critics would be tempted to take a stab at the BBC for being too PC for their own good. On the other hand, such an application would undoubtedly cause the BBC to receive several complaints from the public, and I myself thought the scriptwriters were bold anyway in using the word Negro, which to me has the same stinging effect on the ears as its more derogatory counterpart. The titular character, played by Vinette Robinson, did an outstanding job in her performance, and I have to give credit to the design team too for making her look reasonably accurate to the genuine article. Like with acetylene last week, I never learned about Rosa Parks in school that I can remember, but fortunately the exposition of the dialogue was able to jog my memory, realising that I knew the story but had never bothered to memorise her name. It was very humorous to witness Ryan reflect my ignorance of black history in the bar, giving the audience a reminder of just how important this individual was in starting the civil rights movement and ending segregation. It always astounded me that despite just a decade before the events of this story, the United States had waged war against a country that was practically frothing at the mouth with racial superiority, and yet some of those same tendencies showed up in the South for decades afterwards. I actually really liked that the monster of this week's episode was simply racism, as we see how systemically pernicious and damaging to a society it can be. We see it manifested in human beings instead of conjuring up some CGI enemy designed to wreak havoc. Having said that, this random time traveller antagonist of the story would seem to fit into this description aside from being performed by a human being. He was definitely definitely one of the weakest elements of this story, as we didn't really need him. I felt that the story would have benefited from simply having our characters bumping into Rosa, and their own involvement in history would cause a chain reaction of events that had the potential to stop Rosa from performing her defining act. Admittedly, the butterfly effect does seem to be a bit of a cliche at this point, but ultimately this character just boils down to being a racist with the ability to time travel. The fact he killed 2,000 people and was released from prison is irrelevant and seemingly unconnected to his ideology, but his intentions and actions are bizarrely stupid as well. If Ryan can follow Rosa Parks home in the dark, what's to stop Krasko doing the same thing? He has his time travel blaster thing, just her disappearing from here would do the job, right? There is this scene in the warehouse that he did a really poor job of locking up, where the Doctor magically determines nearly everything about him just from his attire. She's not Sherlock bloody Holmes. In his final scene, he decides to block the road the bus is heading down with his car. Ryan then zaps him with his own weapon, but we didn't even see Ryan pick it up in the motel. The scene where it appears previously, he's about to play with it, but the Doctor throws it away from him. Then it magically appears in his pocket just in time to kick Krasko's ass. How convenient. With the characters constantly riding the bus of doom too, it made me wonder how exactly the characters were able to pay for all the trips. We never see them take any money out from a bank, and it's not like they could just convert their spare change at a Travelex in the 50s either. What's also quite weird about this episode is that I feel a little bit uneasy with just how many times the characters lie and manipulate their way to keeping history intact. This isn't to say that protagonists can't break the rules from time to time, but it just felt a bit awkward every time it took place, like when the Doctor and Yaz pulled a spontaneous Las Vegas trip on the substitute bus driver. Later on, the Doctor and Graham hotwire and steal a bus off screen, and Ryan follows Rosa home, where she just invites him inside for a sing-song with Martin Luther King. What an uneventful cameo that was too. Something else I was surprised that Rosa was okay with was when Yaz just professed to her that she was a police officer. I know that she clocked on to the fact that our Fabulous Four weren't from around these parts, but given that the police are the institution that literally enforce the racism upon the American people, you would have thought she'd have at least widened her eyes and asked her to leave. I mention this too because the episode constantly supports Rosa with this overly dramatic music just to demonstrate how brave she was, and yet she doesn't quite have the brain power to realise when she could potentially be in danger. The moment the episode was leading up to throughout, however, completely blew my expectations. In order to preserve history, Graham ends up being the white guy that needs to be seated, forcing Rosa to stand. His performance here truly shined, and the emotion that he brought to this scene was outstanding. I was expecting the whole thing to repeat itself exactly as we'd expect, but in this twist, the scene just turns itself around into something amazing. Until that song played. Good God on high. Just why? First and foremost, I don't see how the lyrics fit into this scene. She's not exactly doing any rising up, is she? At least until she's forced to by the police anyway. The song also uses the words "for you" over and over again. So in Rosa's case, which individual is she doing this all for? The showrunners seriously overlooked the potential of silence in this scene. It would have been absolutely deafening to watch the entire thing without a song. But no, we had to have an inspirational pop song slided in there that doesn't even fit or have any purpose in being there. Then the Doctor gives the characters another history lesson inside the TARDIS that, despite the struggle, it was worth it all along because she got a medal and an asteroid was named after her. I actually didn't believe the Doctor at first until I googled it afterwards, and I'm also surprised that Yaz didn't hop up and down saying, "I already knew about this from my favourite history lesson," and then the bloody song plays again for the credits. So, did it suck? Well, it's definitely not terrible, but it's certainly not amazing either. It would be interesting to know which parts of this story were written by which writer, seeing as this was a collaborative process. Some of it is absolutely excellent, and I'm glad we finally get to see history shown on Doctor Who with a bit of danger from the time period and not just from some randomly generated monster. We had some great performances in this episode too from the majority of the cast, and the absurdity of these backwards beliefs is now safely ingrained in my brain. However, as previously mentioned, the randomly generated monster does actually appear, and he sucks. We also have some really strange things that the protagonists do towards the end, and the song as well just spoils a fairly decent episode of Doctor Who. I give Rosa a 6 out of 10.
3, 2, 1, go!
Thanks for watching. Expectations are a funny old thing, but it's back to the present day next episode. Come and join the live discussion on my Discord server every Sunday night. Link is in the description.
You done it! You done it! Sinclair, don't you dare! Sinclair.